All the Young Dudes, Sirius's Perspective by Rollercosterwords. Chapter 65. 4th Year, January. Wednesday, the 8th of January, 1975. As Dumbledore had predicted, the Fraser family's murder was plastered across the front page of the news on Boxing Day, accompanied by a slew of features and articles discussing the mounting war. The subject was impossible to avoid for the remainder of Christmas break. It was the first time any of them had seen dark magic, though it certainly wouldn't be the last. None of the boys had any way of knowing how they would come to fear that great black skull, with its gaping mouth and sinister writhing serpent. At the time, it only reminded Sirius of so many family heirlooms. The symbol was distinctly Slytherin-esque. The moment they returned to Hogwarts, he blasted off all of the delicately carved snake motifs off his trunk. "Careful, mate," James warned, as smoke from the blasting spell permeated the room. "You might be ruining a family heirloom there." He definitely was. "I don't give a shit," Sirius muttered, firing his wand as it scorched the wood again, turning the artful craftsmanship into something ugly and deformed. "It's mine, and I don't want anything of mine to have that ruddy mark on it." Even though Dumbledore had said that there was no evidence that the Blacks were involved in the attack, Sirius knew. He knew they were involved with Voldemort. He knew they were involved with dark magic. He knew the things that they thought about Muggles, the things they'd taught him about Muggles. The worst part was that everybody else knew it too. He could feel them thinking it, eyes crawling like beetles over his skin as he walked through the halls. No matter how he tried to distance himself, there was no escaping his own last name. It clung like a fist, like a jaw, like a bruise. His dreams were full of snakes. It had been so long since Sirius had seen his family. His parents didn't write, and even if they happened to cross each other in the halls, Reg didn't want to talk to him anymore. That he managed to, not forget exactly, but ignore at least, the tangled mess of their relationship. The anger he often felt toward them had dulled, the resentment soothed somewhat by distance. But when Sirius stared down at the front page of that paper, he couldn't stop himself from being swallowed by loathing. "I hate them," he thought, staring down at the black snake twisting in the sky. "I hate them." When he boarded the train back to Hogwarts, scanning the station for a glimpse of his parents, wondering if he'd be able to tell, if the violence would line their faces. "I hate them," as he spat toothpaste into the sink, looking in the mirror at his mother's hair, his father's eyes. They were in him, stuck fast to his pure and noble blood. Sirius had never felt such a mindless urge to claw himself open. Of course, there was nothing much he could do with his rekindled hate. His parents weren't at Hogwarts, nor was Voldemort, nor were any of the dark wizards spreading violence and fear outside the insulated walls of the castle. But there were Slytherins. Even before the break, Sirius had enjoyed championing the younger students, the vulnerable ones that bullies like Mulciber picked on. He and James had cast their share of defensive hexes to chase a group of Slytherins ganging up on one of the Muggle-born students. But after the holidays, Sirius resumed his crusade with a newfound passion. Without even realizing it, he found himself spending more and more time wandering the corridors, half hoping to find some poor first year getting picked on, just so that he'd have an excuse to release the anger that threatened to choke him. "The war isn't happening here," Remus tried to tell him, after his third detention in as many days. "Dumbledore told us to be vigilant, not start fights." "The war is everywhere," Sirius said darkly. James nodded, agreeing with him. "Anyway, you can talk. What about you and Snape?" "That," Remus said with a haughty sniff, "was personal." Sirius rolled his eyes, but he knew better than to argue with Moony. He turned back to the book he was reading, Jinxes for Practical Defense, choosing instead to remain silent. It was all well and good for Remus to pretend like the war was some far-off thing. When he wasn't at Hogwarts, he was embenished in the Muggle world, insulated from the messy battles of wizards. And even at Hogwarts, they were somewhat cocooned. It was easy for the students to relax into the fantasy that everything would turn out all right by the time they graduated and had to face the real world. Amongst the marauders, James was the only one who seemed to share Sirius's passion for the cause, which made sense, considering how deeply involved his family was with Dumbledore and his resistance. or whatever he was trying to create with his round of visitations during Christmas break. But James didn't have the same anger as Sirius did. He couldn't understand the personal brand of rage that came with realizing that your parents weren't just mean or bullies, but truly dark, truly evil. It was stupid, because they had always been horrible people, and so he really should have seen it coming. But still, Sirius felt somehow betrayed. There were lines that his family just weren't supposed to cross, and it made him feel horribly naive every time he was surprised to find out that they'd crossed them. James would never understand that. None of his friends would, which was why Sirius tried to hide the worst of it. Already aware of their concern with what they thought was just reckless anger, typical, emotional Sirius lashing out to blow off steam, he couldn't let them see the ugly depths of hate that lay just beneath the surface. It scared him, sometimes, the things he was capable of feeling. "Doesn't she know how much I've matured?" James sighed, pulling Sirius away from the dark turn his thoughts were taking. When he glanced up, the messy-haired boy was staring longingly at Lily Evans. She must have just blown him off again. "I don't know if snogging a muggle at the back of the cinema really counts as maturing," Remus said dryly, picking up James's abandoned textbook and smoothing down the rumpled pages. "I didn't mean that," James grinned. "Just like, in general, I didn't get it. I get on with Marlene, okay?" "You're on the Quidditch team with Marlene," Peter pointed out. "You've got stuff in common with her." Ever since they'd caught him trying to suck Desdemona's face off, apparently she was his girlfriend now, Peter had started to do this annoying thing where he acted like he knew all there was to know about romance. Sirius snorted, but James appeared to be paying attention, desperate for any sort of advice when it came to winning over a certain elusive redhead. "So what?" he said, brows drawing together. "Think I should try and get Lily into Quidditch?" Peter tutted condescendingly. "Why don't you find something you both have in common? Like how me and Desdemona both like chess, and cheese sandwiches, and—" "We've got nothing in common," James interrupted dreamily. "That's why I like her." "Never going to happen then," Peter declared, as if it was already a done deal. James's face fell. "Don't listen to him," Remus said, giving the poor boy a pitying look. "People just don't go out with people because they're the same. That would be boring. Opposites attract and all that." "Yeah, you're right, Moony." James perked up. "Maybe I should find out what sort of stuff she likes, though." Yeah, might be a start," Remus said, an amused smile on his lips, as he returned to his charms essay. Sirius refrained from submitting any kind of his own advice. He'd had quite enough of girls for the time being, after the whole fiasco with the snogging bet, and the frustratingly disappointing kiss in the back of the cinema. Besides, if Peter had a girlfriend, it couldn't be that cool. Luckily, he and James had both got more important things to worry about, namely the up-and-coming Quidditch match against the Slytherins. Sirius was honing in his pent-up fury to make sure that he absolutely demolished his brother's team, channeling every ounce of energy he had into practices. He didn't even complain about James's mental morning drills, dragging himself out of bed without protest when he was roused at sunrise. James seemed delighted to finally have someone as obsessed with Quidditch as he was, and the two of them probably spent more times on their brooms in the weeks leading up to the match than they had the entire previous term. Between Quidditch practice and the numerous detentions that Sirius was racking up due to his belligerent attitude in the corridors, he hardly had any time to spare. He still saw plenty of James, and more than he'd like to of Peter, who came to watch their practices, as always, and seemed to have a sheaf of notes prepared afterwards, none of which were usually very helpful. But they hardly had time to work on the map, or even plan new pranks, partly because Remus was always sequestered away in the library. It got to the point where Sirius only saw Moony at meal times or in their shared classes, as if he were ditching the marauders in favour of his girlfriends. Girl-friends. Remus would correct him whenever any of them teased him about it. When their first Hogsmeade weekend rolled around halfway through January, Sirius, James and Peter were all prohibited from going, detentions, although surprisingly none of them were for the same thing. Remus grumbled that they were hanging him out to dry, and Sirius told him to pick up some new quills, and James asked him if he would mail a package to his parents. Then Remus complained that they were treating him like an owl, but muttered that he may as well pick up some new quills for Peter, too, if he was already going to the shop. Sirius grinned. "You know, you could always take one of your girlfriends. I'm sure they'd love a chance to spend a whole day with your delightful company. Maybe make a trip to Madame Pudfoot's, eh?" Remus groaned loudly, chucking a pillow at his head, and Sirius laughed as he dodged it. Lupin had repeatedly made his aversion to all things romantic quite clear, which only made it all the more fun to tease him about it. At this point it was a well-known fact that he had no ulterior motives when it came to hanging about with the girls, and Sirius hadn't been anywhere near, serious, in his suggestion for Hogsmeade. He only said it because he knew it was guaranteed to get a rise out of Moony, which was why it came as a shock the next morning when Marlene settled down next to the marauders at breakfast, reaching for her tea. "So," she said to Remus, "how did yesterday go?" The other 3 boys paused their conversation about Quidditch tactics, listening in curiously. Moony hadn't mentioned anything out of the ordinary about his trips to Hogsmeade the previous day. He'd just delivered the new quills as promised. Remus looked up from a piece of parchment that he'd been studying, appearing to be just as confused as the rest of them. "Yesterday?" "You and Lily, in Hogsmeade," Marlene prompted, a knowing smile. "She won't tell us what happened, so it must be good." Now Remus was beginning to look alarmed. "What are you talking about?" "Yeah," Sirius echoed, leaning over. "What are you talking about, McKinnon?" "Didn't he tell you?" she asked innocently, stirring sugar into her tea. "Remus and Lily were on a date yesterday." "What?" James, Sirius and Remus all exclaimed at the same time. Sirius began to laugh, unable to help himself. "Moony! On a date?" "With Evans?" James demanded, looking horrified. "Bloody hell," Peter said. "It wasn't a date," Remus protested, voice rising as he slammed down his quill. He was wearing such a comical expression of panic that Sirius began to laugh harder, watching as the poor boy turned desperately to James. "But I don't fancy Lily, she's just a friend." "Yeah, I know, mate," James replied in a subdued voice, not sounding very sure. Sirius's laughter began to die down as he realized that the boy was seemingly genuinely upset. "It's fine. I'll see you after practice." With that, James stood and hurried off, leaving his half-eaten breakfast behind. Sirius stared after him for a moment, then looked back at Remus, and then back to James, before finally shrugging helplessly and getting up to follow his friend out of the hall. Between the 2 of them, he was pretty sure that Potter needed him more right then. The poor boy had just had his heart broken after all. Chapter 66, 4th year, February. The Hogsmeade business with Lily, while initially hilarious, only Remus would be oblivious enough not to realise he was on a date, quickly became a thorn in Sirius's side. The problem was James. James Potter, Quidditch prodigy, pure-blood heir, Gryffindor's golden boy, had been completely spoilt by love. He'd received an abundance of it growing up, from doting parents that assured him that he was the centre of their universe, giving him all the confidence and warmth of a blazing sun. This made him entitled, perhaps, and arrogant, certainly, but the self-assured bravado was hardly misplaced. He received good marks in school, exhibited extraordinary skill on the Quidditch pitch, and displayed a natural knack for magic. It was difficult to fault him for his ego when there was so much to back it up. And besides, with James every victory was a shared thing. His exuberance was never limited to his own achievements. He brought up those around him, too. It was impossible to dislike someone so selfless, so genuinely kind, who never seemed to look down on others, even when he knew they were looking up to him. It was why Sirius was so drawn to James. He was the complete opposite of everything the Blacks stood for. His parents had always acted like the only way to distinguish oneself was to step on the heads of others, but James proved that wasn't true. He was like something out of a storybook, the main character, the hero. The only person who seemed entirely immune to his charms was Lily Evans, which was unfortunate, as she was, for some utterly unfathomable reason, perhaps the only individual in the castle that James truly wanted to impress. The problem when it came to growing up with too much love, Sirius thought, was that James never learnt how to swallow disappointment. All the other marauders had plenty of experience dealing with hurt feelings. Sirius would pick a fight, Remus would throw a punch, and Peter was just particularly an expert when it came to sulking. But James presented, perhaps for the first time in his life, with a unique combination of jealousy and self-pity. Didn't seem to know how to deal with it. The result was, for an entire week, he stopped talking to Remus. It wasn't intentional. Sirius knew that James would never try to freeze his friend out on purpose. It was just that he was jealous, and he knew he had no right to be, because Lily was allowed to fancy whomever she wanted to fancy, and it was pretty clear that Remus hadn't been trying to encourage her affections. But knowing all of that only made James feel sorer for himself, until he could hardly look at Lupin without drowning in self-pity. Of course, this only led Remus to fall into one of his well-worn, everybody hates me and I deserve it shtick. This boy was just itching to be a martyr. He tiptoed around James with mournful, guilty glances, as if he had done something wrong. Sirius indulged a few uncomfortably vivid fantasies about throttling Lily Evans for starting this whole mess, and then throttling James and Remus too, for acting so stupid about it. "He isn't angry with you," Sirius explained for the umpteenth time, after James had scurried away to bed one night the moment Remus had set foot in the common room. "He's just feeling sorry for himself." "He doesn't believe me though, does he?" Remus fretted. "I really didn't know it was a date. I didn't even like Lily that way." Sirius sighed, trying to figure out how best to explain the situation so that Remus would understand. He could be so oblivious sometimes when it came to girls. "Well, I don't think he thinks you're lying, exactly. But you are pretty close to Evans, aren't you? Always going around together." "She's my friend," Remus insisted, sounding very frustrated. "I'll go round with Marlene and Mary too. No one thinks I'm going out with them." "Actually," Sirius said, smirking, "there was a rumour last term—" "Oh, for God's sake!" Sirius sympathised with his friend's frustration, but Remus had to understand that being friends with girls simply wasn't the same as being friends with boys. He couldn't explain why, precisely. It just wasn't. Everyone knew that. The situation was only made worse by the fact that Lily continued to spend quite a bit of time with Remus. The both of them seemed to be determined to act as if nothing had happened, and went on being partners in potions without any fuss. When Sirius walked into the classroom and saw them together, he tactfully moved his and James's things to the back table, as far away as possible from Evans. By Friday dinner time, things had grown extremely tense. The Marauders continued to sit together at meals, but with James and Remus both moping instead of speaking, it was up to Sirius and Peter to try and keep up a conversation. And all Peter wanted to do was talk about his new girlfriend, which only made things worse. Sirius had to keep kicking him under the table to get him to shut up about Desdemona's chess strategy. He tried to switch subjects to the upcoming Gryffindor vs Slytherin match, but even Quidditch couldn't draw James out of his funk, and his uncharacteristic silence only darkened the mood. To make matters even worse, Mary, Marlene and Lily had noticed that Remus was looking a bit left out and had all decided to sit next to him. "Looking forward to the match?" Mary said cheerfully. "All of the Hufflepuffs and Ravenclaws I've spoken about are supporting Gryffindor too." Lily sighed dramatically. "Why does it always have to be so black and white? No one's good all over and no one's bad all over. Not even Slytherins." "You're bad all over," Sirius thought petulantly. The whole Goody Two-Shoes act was so irritating. How did anyone put up with her? "You can't blame us, Lily," Marlene said. "Even if it's not all of them, most of the Slytherins have been utterly foul this year." Over Lily's shoulder, Sirius caught sight of Snape, creeping towards the Gryffindor table, as if summoned by her valiant defence of Slytherin. No doubt, he'd just be proving Marlene's point. Sirius rolled his eyes and turned back to Peter, renewing their discussion on Quidditch tactics. He had no desire to watch Snivelus drool over Evans. He saw enough of that in potions. He was just about to explain an idea he had for a tweak in their current flying formation. Peter was nodding eagerly, occasionally asking James what he thought to try and get him to speak, when there was suddenly an ear-splitting bang from the other end of the hall. The entire student body seemed to jump, and heads turned abruptly to stare over at the Slytherin table, where Mulciber had just set off a firecracker. He was laughing delightedly at the panic on his peers' faces. They tried to locate the source of the frightening noise. 5 points from Slytherin, McGonagall shouted, marching over in the aisles between the tables. "And you'll clean up that mess at once." Everyone settled down, and the typical buzz of the chatter resumed. Sirius shook his head, disgusted, as he turned back to Peter and James. No sense of artistry, I swear. Mortimer's pranks get more and more stupid every year. Hardly even know if you can call that a prank, James muttered, poking dejectedly at his food. Sirius perked up, glad that he got his friend to say something. Next to Remus, Marlene was asking about a hinky-punk essay. Sirius ignored her, focusing on James. "Excellent point, Potter," he said imperiously. "Such trite and trivial disruptions should hardly measure up to the noble title of pranks. Tomfoolery, perhaps. Buffoonery." He was gearing up to do a list of possible synonyms when he heard his name, falling from the lips of one Remus Lupin. "I'll lend you my notes if you want, once Sirius gives them back." Sirius looked over, distracted from his word game. It didn't seem to be cheering James up, anyway. "Oh, yeah, Mooney. Sorry, hang on. They're just in my bag." He began to search, digging through his mess of a book bag, which was cluttered with scrunched-up balls of parchment, dung bombs, sweets, and broken quills. "How'd you even find anything in there?" Remus said, scrunching up his nose, as he took a sip of pumpkin juice. "You're the messiest person I've ever met." Sirius gave him a shrug and a wink, withdrawing his notes with a flourish and passing them over to Marlene. "Oh, Remus," Mary grinned. "Did I tell you I had another letter from Darren this week?" Remus moaned. "Yes," he whined, "and it was just as boring as the last 500 letters you've made me read." Sirius snorted, almost choking on laughter in his shock. Marlene dropped her fork. Lily's eyes grew 2 sizes, and Mary looked appalled. She opened and closed her mouth a few times, stunned speechless. Remus blinked, frowning at them. He looked a bit confused, as if he'd just surprised himself. Sorry," he said, mumbled, looked away. Sirius grinned, thoroughly entertained. "No, I'm sorry," Mary huffed, standing up. She looked very offended and a bit weepy. "I won't bore you any more, then." Sirius watched as she turned on her heel and left the room, abandoning her half-eaten dinner. "Mary!" Marlene cried in dismay, hurrying over to follow her. Lily remained, but she looked very upset when she asked Remus, "Did you mean that?" "Yeah," he responded without hesitating. "Actually, I find all this boyfriend and girlfriend stuff boring, and I wish we could all just leave me alone." The moment he stopped speaking, he blinked, lifting a hand towards his mouth, as though he couldn't quite believe what he'd just said. "Remus!" Lily exclaimed, flabbergasted. Unlike Mary, she didn't storm off. Instead saying tartly, "There's nothing wrong with Mary wanting to talk about her boyfriend, or teenagers having crushes. It's normal, isn't it?" "I don't care if it's normal," Remus shrugged. "I think you're all acting like idiots. Even you. Why on earth would you want to go on a date with me, when the most popular boy in school is madly in love with you? He's 10 times nicer than me, too. You're just too arrogant to see it." James and Sirius exchanged a shocked glance. As entertaining as it was to listen to Remus telling the girls off, it was very unlike him to be so rude. Usually he just stewed in silence when he didn't like something. "Remus!" Lily yelped, blushing. "Well, it's true." "Mooney," Sirius said cautiously, "are you okay?" "I'm fine. Still a bit hungry, though. Think Mary will mind if I finish the potatoes?" "Seriously, Remus," James said, speaking directly to him for the first time that day. "This isn't like you at all." "I'm just being honest." "Yeah, brutally honest." "Oh, Merlin!" Sirius smacked his hand to his forehead. "Evans, did Snape put something in his drink when the firework went off?" "He would never do something like that. It's illegal." "Pfft!" Remus snorted around a mouthful of mashed potato. "As if Snivelus gives a toss. He's been trying to get back at me ever since I hit him on the train." "You what?" Lily gasped, horrified. "Yeah?" Remus paused to swallow. "Nutted him right across the head. It was great." There was a note of panic in his eyes now, as he seemed to realise what was happening. "Right!" Sirius stood, fuming. "Stop talking, Mooney, before you say something you'll regret." Remus immediately disobeyed the order, grinning up at him and musing, "You know, that's exactly what Snape said to me on the stairs the other day." "Severus!" Lily shouted, stupidly drawing the attention of all the surrounding students. Sirius cursed her mentally as she stood and stormed over to the Slytherin table. But he grabbed Remus's arm, and the marauders followed behind her. "What have you done to Remus?" Lily demanded, huffing and puffing as she stamped her foot on the flagstones. "Why do you ask?" Severus said with an oily smirk. "You tell me how to fix him right now." "There's nothing wrong with him," Snape drawled, a mean glint in his eye. is there, Remus?" "Nothing really," Remus responded politely. "Although, I do keep saying things I shouldn't, though, like—" "Shut up!" Sirius growled, kicking him so hard in the shin to distract him from speaking. He rounded on the Slytherin boy as Remus hissed in pain. "You bastard! It's Verita's serum, isn't it? Truth potion." "One way to find out." Snape's wicked smile widened. "What's your deepest, darkest secret, Lupin?" "No." Sirius turned, horrified, to see Remus opening his mouth. He knew exactly what the boy was about to say, could see the words already forming behind his eyes. The deepest, darkest secret that he had. The wolf crawling up the back of his throat, ready to leap out in the middle of the great hall. Sirius could already see how it would happen. He'd mindlessly gut himself for Snape's amusement. How the students would recoil and the murmurs would spread. "Werewolf, werewolf, did you hear that? He's a werewolf." And everyone would know. And there would be letters from parents, and Dumbledore might have to... "Well, I'm a—" "Silencio!" Sirius shouted, desperately. He'd never used a silencing spell on another person before, but it was the only way. Still, he could feel his brother's eyes on him, watching him from down the table, knowing what he'd see. The sharp voice, the cold sneer, the elegant flick of the wrist. They both knew what it felt like. The strange tug from the back of your throat as your voice got stolen away. He felt sick to his stomach. In the same moment, James tackled Remus, throwing them both on the floor as he clamped a hand over his mouth. The Slytherin table jeered behind them as James and Remus struggled, Lily watching them in shock. Remus wriggled free of James's grasping fingers, mouth still moving as he tried to divulge every one of his secrets, but not even a whisper of a sound escaped his lips. Sirius glanced back, only once, stomach churning. Unlike his friends, Regulus wasn't laughing. He sat silently at the table of cheering Slytherins, staring at the wand in Sirius's hand, his mouth a thin line. The marauders hauled Remus to his feet, and Sirius didn't look back again as they dragged him out of the hall, ignoring the Slytherins' taunts. The moment they were safely back in their dorm room, Sirius lifted his charm, skin crawling. "Sorry, Remus," he apologized immediately, "but I had to do it. You were going to—" "Oh no," Remus interrupted him, frowning as he sat down on the bed. "Bloody Snape. How long does it take to wear off?" "Depends on how much you took, I think," James replied, paging frantically through his potion book. "Godric, how did he do it? That's Newt-level stuff, truth serum." "He's the best in our year at potions," Remus answered promptly. "Lily said he's already doing 7th year essays, just for fun." "What a boring old swot," Sirius snorted, still jittery with nerves. He grabbed his own potion book, joining James in his search. "Just try not to say anything, okay, Moony?" "I can't help it," Remus responded automatically. Okay. Right, it says here we should be clear within 24 hours, so dinner time tomorrow at the very latest." "What about lessons?" "We'll just say you're sick. You can't risk it, Moony. I could kill Snape, that filthy, dirty, underhanded—" "I'm not missing any lessons because of him," Remus said stubbornly, crossing his arms. "There must be an antidote." "We could go and ask Slughorn," James suggested. "Yeah, good idea. I think he's still in the Great Hall," Sirius said quickly, turning to Remus. He spoke slowly and clearly, trying to get the order to sink through into that thick skull. "Remus, stay here." "Oh, bugger off." Remus turned away, pouting. "I'll stay with him," James offered. You two go." Sirius nodded, then raced towards the door, eager to find a solution. He didn't want to ever have to use a silencing spell like that ever again. "Hang in there, Moony," he called back, bounding down the stairs. "If I see a Slytherin on my way down, I'll hex him for you." Peter scurried behind him, let out a nervous giggle, and they made their way together towards the Great Hall. To Sirius's great relief, Slughorn had the antidote for Verita serum on hand. He grumbled suspiciously as he pulled it out of his cabinet, grumpy that they'd interrupted his dinner, and made them listen to a long-winded lecture that essentially boiled down to "don't muck about with potions if you don't have an antidote ready," before finally sending them scurrying back to the Gryffindor Tower. Sirius half wished that he could tell the Slytherin head of house that it was one of his precious students that had dosed Remus, but the Marauder's code of honour strictly forbid tattling. "It's better this way," Remus said grimly after chugging the antidote. "It'll make him really nervous if he doesn't get into trouble straight away." He'll wonder how we're going to get him back. How are we going to get him back? How are we going to get him back? Sirius asked eagerly, as they sat down for breakfast on the morning of the Slytherin v Gryffindor match. He nearly outed you, Moony. We have to teach him a lesson. While nothing horrible had actually ended up happening, aside from Remus hurting the girl's feelings a little bit, which Sirius actually found quite funny, the panic, as he casted the silencing spell, was still fresh in Sirius's mind, as was Snape's greasy, sadistic smile. Let me think about it, Remus replied. Just thrash Slytherin in Quidditch for me first. Easy, Sirius winked, and Remus grinned at him, eyes bright. The tension that had been building between the two houses all year lay thick over the Quidditch pitch, and two quarters of the spectators were clothed in bright red, jeering at the Slytherins in the stands. Quidditch had become an outlet for everyone's feelings about the war, and it wasn't very pretty. Tensions are high with this year's semi-final, Tracy Darcy, the commentator, said via magical microphone. This match will of course determine which team goes through to the final against Ravenclaw, and by the looks of all the players it should be a close one. On Gryffindor we have Potter, of course, a legend in his own right, with more than 200 goals under his belt already. Marlene McKinnon there, a formidable beater, and so she should be, with her brother Danny McKinnon, of course, who plays professionally for the Chudley Cannons. And there's Sirius Black, Gryffindor's second beater. In his second game of the year, Black has already shown himself to be as competent as McKinnon, and I'm sure all the ladies will agree he doesn't look half bad in that kit. Ahem. McGonagall's pointed cough could be heard through the microphone, and Sirius grinned. While as competent as McKinnon wasn't exactly the highest of praise he'd ever received, it was certainly fun to hear his name screamed by what must be nearly every girl in the crowd, at least every girl with eyes. He knew what he looked like. He'd spent 15 minutes in front of the bathroom mirror that morning, strategically untucking strands of hair from his ponytail, until James had pounded on the door and threatened a few very creative methods of murder if he didn't hurry up. "Sorry, Professor," Tracy continued. "And here comes Slytherin," deafening boos from the crowd, which made Sirius smile even wider. "They have their very own Black on the team, of course, Sirius's younger brother, Regulus, Seeker, and Mulcifer taken on Beta this term." The booing was now so loud that Sirius could hardly hear Darcy's commentary anymore. He didn't turn to look as his brother walked onto the field. Instead, he stared at the crowd, screaming and jeering and cheering for him. He wasn't holding his wand, but he could swear he felt magic in his fingertips. The game finally began, and he was nothing but energy, every nerve, every muscle in his body taut, weightless with adrenaline. All emotion disappearing. The booing was now so loud that Sirius could hardly hear Darcy's commentary anymore. He didn't turn to look as his brother walked onto the field, instead staring into the crowd, screaming and jeering and cheering for him. He wasn't holding his wand, but he could swear that he felt magic at his fingertips. The game finally began, and he was nothing but energy, every nerve, every muscle in his body taut, weightless with adrenaline. All emotion disappeared. Anger, resentment, and fear turned to molten, and reforged into the steely resolve that above all else they had to win. Nothing existed outside of the pitch. Both teams were out for blood. James was inhumane, flying at an almost frightening speed through the air. He caught and tossed the quaffle before his opponents could even process the movement, robes flapping, a streak of red lightning across the sky. Sirius felt a fierce burst of pride every time James scored, but he had his own game to worry about. He and Marlene had developed a new strategy, specifically for this match, and they put it into practice now, sharing one mind as they moved on their broomsticks. A glance was all it took to communicate, to know when they needed to change positions, or cover different teammates' backs. Marlene shadowed their Seeker, shielding him from the bludgers that the Slytherins sent his way. They were fighting dirty, but then, everyone already expected that. Sirius ran himself ragged, darting every which way across the pitch as he tried to protect his teammates from the bludgers. He could feel himself sweating, strands of his hair sticking to his skin as he swung his bat. He had just shot halfway across the field to knock out one of the violent missiles away from heartbeat, and when he turned back he was confronted with Mulciber's ugly smile. The boy had smacked the second bludger, and it was barrelling straight towards Sirius's face. He didn't even have time to think, only act as, by reflex, he lifted his bat, arms burning, and swung. The force of the collision sent a painful jolt through Sirius's wrist, which he ignored, watching as the bludger shot straight back at Mulciber. The Slytherin ducked immediately, swooping down, and behind him it was Regulus. Reggie, who wasn't watching for bludgers because he had to focus on the snitch, hands already stretching out as he dove for the little golden ball flitting away from his fingertips, just out of reach, and Sirius tried to call his name. He needed to warn him, but it was too late, and the crowd was shrieking, and he heard the dull sound of the bludger's impact on his brother's skull. Regulus fell, and the entire world disappeared.